Hello, all. This is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. And in this particular video, I'm going to talk to you about how to keep yourself relevant as a professor, teacher, graduate student, PhD, whatever it is that you're thinking of doing. So if you don't know me, I'm Associate Professor of Innovation Strategy and Entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people that helped me out that I wanted to pay the favor forward and help you out. All right, so currently right now I'm traveling. I'm at the Strategic Management Society conference. Sounds very sophisticated, but really it's just a bunch of nerds that get together and talk about management ideas. One of the things I noticed during the conference is that there's many new techniques that are coming up and that seem really interesting, right? So currently right now, 2019, people are talking about things like machine learning, neural nets, all sorts of really interesting sort of qualitative methods. Some people are introducing new management theories that I've never seen before. There's many sort of discussions that are going in different directions, maybe talking about, so for example, how businesses are leveraging, the things that they're doing, the sort of business aspect of things, of making money, to leveraging how they do business to solve sort of large real world problems like poverty or, human trafficking, things along those lines. It's pretty wonderful to sort of see some of these things that are popping up that are all so relevant, and they appear to be really cool and interesting. And you might be sort of at the same sort of situation right now where you are maybe thinking about, looking to see what you can bring into your classroom. Maybe you're thinking about specific case studies that are relevant to the times in 2019. Maybe you're thinking about the latest research methods that are really cool. Again, like things like machine learning, natural language processing, or some of the latest phenomenon, whatever it is that you're thinking about. We all struggle with this sort of aspect of teaching and sort of doing research or whatever it is that you're thinking about. We all struggle with being relevant. So Jim March, the late Jim March, he was very influential and basically created the whole field of management. There was many other people that sort of had influence on the field of management. But Jim March was definitely one of the more influential people that we have in our society in terms of having impacts on psychology and political science and what we understand about organizations, all sorts of different stuff. And he said multiple times actually, when asked this particular question in terms of how to stay relevant, he says, I'm not now, nor have I ever been relevant. So it's kind of curious, this particular person that had tremendous amount of impact in so many different fields. And in fact, if you simply just read some of his work, it doesn't necessarily ring that he was talking about a specific thing at the time. There's not necessarily one particular moment, or, maybe during the 60s, he wasn't talking about all the protests that were happening in the 60s. During the 70s, he wasn't talking about the OPEC oil crisis, although, maybe it did sort of impact in terms of what he was thinking about. There was nothing really that was relevant with what he ever said. This is where I want to sort of start the conversation with this, is that the problem is, in terms of becoming relevant, is that you will never, ever become relevant with what you're ever saying. So there is always somebody else, another person, or another sort of area that seems more appealing, more relevant than currently what you're doing right now. So if you're watching this video, I'm going to keep this video up for years. It'd be interesting if you would comment as the years progress whether this video is actually relevant to you in terms of discussions about machine learning, for example, or natural language processing, or instrumental variable regressions. I would love for you, if you're watching this 10 years from now, to sort of specify and talk about whether these are sort of relevant conversations right now, because you're never going to be relevant at the time when you're actually doing the thing that you're talking about. And the problem is, it's the state of information that we have around us, right? So there's always information that's flowing towards you And in order to get the most relevant, you have to immediately absorb the information that is coming towards you, process it absolutely immediately, within instantaneously, and sort of make a decision or come up with some sort of new thing based on that immediately. So you can imagine that is impossible to do. You will never become relevant. The information, by the time you absorb it and process it and make sense of it and actually transform it into something that you yourself is teaching, is not going to be relevant in any sort of way. So I'll give you an example. You might learn about machine learning. So currently right now I'm at this conference. I think it's kind of cool. I might learn about machine learning, and then I might go home, and then I have to sort of absorb that, write that information. Then I have to process it. So it means that I have to sort of think about what that actually means. Then I have to sort of absorb more information, study textbooks, or maybe it's cases, maybe it's some manuscripts that are out there, and make sense of it. So by the time I actually absorb that information, make sense of it, it's probably going to be about 6 months from now, perhaps even longer. Maybe it's going to be a year from now. And then by the time I actually absorb it, make sense of it, then I have to apply it in some sort of way. So maybe it is having a conversation within the classroom about it. Maybe it is, maybe making a paper, or writing a paper, research paper on that. And so by the time I actually become relevant, and actually do something with this thing, you're probably looking at 2 or 3 years from now by the time, and I'm assuming many more people absorb information and process information a heck of a lot faster than I am. So by the time you're actually relevant, it is going to be 3 years from now. And then you're presenting a paper that is already outdated. The stuff that you're doing is already outdated. And it doesn't matter how many resources you have. You might have a lab with 100 different people. You might be in a classroom that gets millions of dollars that are spent on sort of trying to stay state of the art. It's never, ever going to be absolutely relevant with the information that you have. So to give you an example, textbooks, completely irrelevant. It's all sort of based on general trends. By the time they actually get out, the information is already really dated. And you will notice that with a lot of different cases whenever you're sort of looking at textbooks. So perhaps what you should be doing is teaching from newspapers, right? So instead of textbooks, you should be teaching or researching based on newspapers. But if you look at that information that's in newspapers, it's already outdated, right? It's a day, maybe 2 days old by the time it's actually published in whatever newspaper that you're looking at. Sometimes it's even longer. Maybe it's months old by the time it actually gets published in the particular paper. But then that's already outdated, right? So that information is outdated compared to what you would use in Twitter. So Twitter is going to be a lot more immediate, a lot more quicker to absorb. That information is much more at your fingertips. But the problem is that's not even relevant in any sort of way, because you should probably be paying attention to gossip or information that is coming towards you at that moment, other than Twitter. By the time you actually check your Twitter, it's already outdated. So what happens with that information, though? As you're absorbing that information, it becomes increasingly more noisy, and you don't necessarily see any particular patterns in that data. Try to read and make sense of what's going on Twitter. If you sort of belong to many different people, there's no way that you can keep track of all of this stuff. There's a tremendous amount of noise, whether it's from the individuals themselves tweeting and sort of talking back and forth, versus having machines that are there doing this, or just kind of random things that are happening on the Twitter platform. It's always going to be very, very noisy, and you can't absorb that information very well. So that's the fundamental problem with the becoming relevant, is that it is impossible to draw any sort of general trends and make sense of underlying signals that are going on behind the scenes that you can't necessarily see. So in order to become relevant, and this is just kind of, based on what I've learned and what I've seen other people do, is that you have to really just disregard what everybody else is saying, right? So you don't want to necessarily become relevant. That's not necessarily a productive sort of discussion you want to get into. What you have to look for is theoretical lessons that transcend all of these sort of micro events and micro changes that are happening in the environment. The environment is constantly your environment. Whatever it is that you're looking around you, it's constantly being updated, it's constantly changing. So what you're trying to do is actually generalize based on that information. so that you can make a better action going forward. So what you're trying to do is you have to somewhat disregard that information that is flowing towards you and try to make sense of it. So if somebody is saying you to become more relevant, to keep up with the times, you have to fundamentally disregard some of the stuff that they're actually saying. You have to, so this is a second thing to think about, is you should probably actually be out of sync from the market. That's actually really interesting when you're out of sync of what everybody else is doing. There's a tremendous amount of information that you can gather by sort of studying or making sense of things that where you're completely out of sync. So for example, you might be interested in how Twitter works, for example. Well, if you study what newspapers did, or you study information processing, for example, as really irrelevant, that stuff's pretty old in terms of how we understand that stuff to work. You're going to get a tremendous amount of insights about what's actually occurring on Twitter by simply just looking at what other people did. And in fact, a lot of scholars and a lot of researchers, they'll study things that are 200, 300, maybe a couple of thousand years old to sort of make sense of what's actually going on around us. And it's really pretty fascinating in terms of the insights that you can get, as long as you believe that the things that you're seeing can be generalized across many different years or many different sort of situations, which hopefully if they're doing good science, they should be able to transcend and generalize across many different areas. The third thing that you should do, and I think this is, for me, this is really important. And this is kind of a lesson that I've learned just for my sanity and for who I am as a person. Because I get, you always get these kind of requests from students to become more relevant, talk about the latest. So I teach innovation, right? I talk about technologies, and some of the stuff I talk about is pretty old, right? Like typewriters. Who talks, who actually uses a typewriter in this day and age, right? Or, talking about the railways that were formed, a couple 150 years ago. It's really old stuff, right? And so students are always like, oh, let's talk about, so if I mention it, right? So Rent the Runway, I mentioned that now in 2019, it's already outdated, right? Like it's not necessarily all that sort of surprising and interesting, right? So they're always talking about things that are more interesting, more relevant to them. And the problem is that you have to stay true to yourself, right? So what's happening with that is that you're letting other people's motivations and their perspectives drive what you are currently doing, right? So they are trying to persuade you in some sort of way to become a little bit more relevant to what they know as an individual. And the problem is when that happens is they have okay information, not perfect, but they have okay information about that kind of stuff. Or it might be something that they're just curious about and they read a couple of newspapers articles about. They know that stuff a little bit better than you do, right? So just because it's relevant, it means it's relevant to them. They've processed it. They've sort of thought about that particular thing. And what's relevant to you, so me, I might be really interested in something that I read about, that's 100 years old, right? And it's really relevant to me. It sort of makes sense to me. It's going to appear not relevant to them. But in order to sort of learn lessons for them, whoever it is that they're talking or that you're maybe having this conversation with, you always should be irrelevant. That doesn't necessarily jive with the stuff that they are currently doing, right? Because that means that they are absorbing new information, something that's completely different than they've never seen before. And then hopefully they will become a little bit more, that information will become more relevant to them, right? So it's an updating process of information that they have. So you have to be very careful with becoming relevant, because it's very much sort of thinking about who is it relevant to, right? And that's the biggest thing to think about, is that whatever it's relevant to, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not relevant. You're probably relevant to the current sort of things that you know. And if you're trying to teach somebody or show somebody some new insights, you probably always should be irrelevant. It doesn't make sense for you to become completely relevant because they already have that information, right? So if you have a lesson that's 300 years old, or it's about some weird phenomenon that happened long, long time ago, or even just from the 70s or from the 80s or from the 1990s. That seems like, we already know that kind of stuff. No, 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 no. They don't know that stuff. You already know that stuff. They don't necessarily know that information and sort of have seen it in a different light like you have. So it's going to appear a little bit, it doesn't really appear relevant to them, but it appears relevant to you. And it's your job to sort of tell your story and talk openly, whatever, maybe it's a research method that you're looking into, just to be relevant. What you're trying to do is to tell your story and communicate that information. So then they start seeing that, why it's kind of interesting to you. And then they'll start saying, maybe this is actually pretty relevant to the conversation. All right. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. I do appreciate it. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. I do appreciate it. And it's funny with these YouTube videos, I put them out. They're never going to be relevant in any sort of way. By the time you actually get them, they're a little dated. And then by the time that, maybe you watch them, maybe it's going to be 10 years from now, it's already going to be dated. And maybe I'm hoping that some of these lessons will actually help you out with dealing with the things that you're currently doing in the time and age that you actually watch these. All right. Take care. Bye.